Okay, so for the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on, I'm going to talk about U.S. foreign policy toward Central America with a focus on U.S. foreign policy towards Guatemala because I think this will help you understand The Tattooed Soldier by Hector Tobar, which follows the journey of a Guatemalan immigrant in Los Angeles who fled this political violence in Guatemala. But first, I want to give a little some broader context about Central America before going into the history of Guatemala. So, in the 1980s, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala were racked by civil wars. The U.S. government provided financial and military aid that helped to shape the nature of these conflicts. Under Ronald Reagan, who was the president in the 1980s, the U.S. government viewed Central American civil wars as theaters in the larger Cold War. So this larger Cold War, the struggle between capitalist and communist or socialist countries. In Nicaragua, a group called the Sandinistas, a leftist political party and guerrilla army, had ousted the dictator Anastasio Somoza in 1979. And because of the leftist politics of the Sandinistas, the U.S. government supported a rebel army called the Contras in their fight to topple the government. So you have this sort of right-wing rebel army called the Contras who are trying to topple the leftist government of the Sandinistas. In El Salvador, the military government was fighting leftist rebels. So you have a right-wing military government fighting against leftist rebels, with the U.S. government sending high levels of financial and military aid to the government in El Salvador, the Salvadoran government, to suppress this leftist rebellion. Okay, you'll recall a few weeks ago we talked a little about U.S. foreign policy towards Guatemala when, in 1954, democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz implemented a land reform plan that involved confiscating uncultivated land from the United Fruit Company. The U.S. government engineered a military coup to overthrow his government. In the decades following this 1954 coup in Guatemala, the country was ruled by a series of military governments which were incredibly repressive and violent. There's a longer, more complex history to be told here, but I'm going to fast forward to the 1970s to make sure you have the basic context that you need to understand Hector Tobar's novel. So Mayans, the main indigenous or Native American group in Guatemala, who made up the majority of the population, were incredibly poor, in large part due to the failures of land reform in the 1950s. So in other words, the intense concentration of land in very few hands, particularly in the hands of the United Fruit Company. Because Mayans owned so little land, many found work on plantations on the southern coast. Rigoberta Menchú, who's pictured here, for instance, is a Guatemalan activist who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992, remembered on working on these plantations as a kid, as a 10-year-old. In the early 1970s, a massive social movement grew in the cities as well as in the countryside, the main purpose of which was to demand an end to economic exploitation and economic inequality. So peasants were demanding access to land, and workers demanded fair wages and a right to organize. Liberation theology, sort of a kind of Catholicism which advocated social and economic justice, became popular in Guatemala as well as other areas of Latin America and helped to push this movement forward. So liberation theology is a kind of a variation of Catholicism, or a group within Catholicism that promoted social and economic justice. So in response to this mass movement, the military, the government, chose to violently repress the movement rather than to concede to change. And when nonviolent efforts to change were met with government repression, people being thrown in jail, people being brutalized, people in Guatemala formed various leftist guerrilla armies. And the killing and torture of subversives, I should say quote-unquote subversives was the order of the day in this period. So in the civil war between these leftist guerrilla armies and the military government. People were taken in the middle of the night and never seen again. They became known collectively as the, quote, disappeared. And by the end of this war in Guatemala, as many 50,000 activists were disappeared, and it's estimated that around 200,000 civilians were killed or disappeared during the conflict, mostly at the hands of the army. The Guatemalan government has since been accused of committing genocide. The U.S. government financed successive military governments in Guatemala after it helped to orchestrate the 1954 overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz. So, in addition to sending military and financial aid to the military government in Guatemala, um, the U.S. government also was involved in training, the direct training of Guatemalan army officers, the same officers tasked with suppressing activism as well as the guerrilla armies. The U.S. worked with the army to develop a counter-insurgency campaign to defeat the guerrillas. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan authorized a covert CIA military program that spent hundreds of millions of dollars during the 80s to support the military in Guatemala. And this, again, remembers all in service of the global Cold War, this effort to fight communism that begins after World War II and lasts through the 1980s. So because of this political violence throughout Central America in the 1980s, there was large-scale Central American immigration to the United States. So it's estimated that between 1981 and 1990, almost 1 million Salvadorans and Guatemalans fled violence in their home countries, made the dangerous trek through Mexico, and entered the U.S. Clandestinely. In 1980, the U.S. government passed the Refugee Act, a humanitarian law meant to help immigrants fleeing persecution and violence claim asylum within the U.S. So U.S. foreign policy heavily influenced decisions about who could get political asylum. Since the U.S. government was supporting the governments, the right-wing military governments of Guatemala and El Salvador, it tended to deny the occurrence of atrocities committed by those governments. And the result was that Salvadorans and Guatemalans who were fleeing this political violence were often denied political asylum and had to enter the United States without legal documents, in other words, as undocumented immigrants. Members of the militaries of both governments, however, were often granted the right to immigrate. So in the novel, Longoria, the novel The Tattooed Soldier, Longoria is given legal status, right? He's able to immigrate to the United States legally, whereas Antonio, who's fleeing political violence after his wife and child are killed, he enters the United States without legal papers. Nicaraguan immigrants claiming asylum because they feared the leftist Sandinista government were, on the other hand, granted asylum. So to sum up, the U.S. government, through its military and financial aid, helped to create the conditions that pushed Central Americans to immigrate to the United States. Once here, however, many Central Americans, especially Salvadorans and Guatemalans, had to live in the shadows as undocumented immigrants. They thus struggled to find work and to put the pieces of their lives back together. Okay, so hundreds of thousands of people in the United States protested against U.S. policies in Central America. And there's actually a scene or two in the novel in which you see people protesting U.S. government policy. There was something called a sanctuary movement that consisted of a network of religious congregations that offered legal and humanitarian assistance to Central American immigrants fleeing violence. At the height of the sanctuary movement, 150 congregations openly defied the federal government by publicly sponsoring and supporting undocumented Guatemalan and Salvadoran immigrants. Sanctuary activists even coordinated with activists in Mexico to smuggle immigrants across the border into the United States. So this is the essential context that you need, I think, for the novel, or I think anyway, helpful context for the novel. But you could also, of course, read over the chapter in Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty, which talks about U.S. foreign policy towards Central America in the 1980s as well. Okay, hope this was helpful.